The Automata initiative brings Netrunner to South America, and alongside a brand new mechanic, Expendable. For deep within the Amazon rainforest, it takes the Weyland Consortium to truly understand what can stay and what can burn. Slash and burn agriculture. The jungle is dark but full of diamonds. No worries, Willie, we'll just burn the whole thing down. Cybersand Harvester. Free credits drill down from your defenses. Instant speed is a mighty trick, but how long does it stand? Tree line. We'd like to take a moment to remind the public that for every tree we cut down, we plant 3 more. Well, in cyberspace at least. And finally, B1001. As Terminator stalks the streets of Rio, Sao Paulo. You can run, you definitely can't hide. These are just 4 exciting cards from the upcoming The Automata Initiative. I put these cards here at the front of the video for those who wanted to quickly take a look, but join me as we dive into what we think we can do with these upcoming cards. Hey, welcome back to the Métropole Grid. My name is Andre. Thanks so much for tuning in. As you saw there at the top of the video, we have 4 brand new cards today to reveal from the upcoming set, The Automata Initiative. A set of 65 new cards that is dropping in about, it's actually less than a week from the time this video comes out, so we don't have that much longer to wait. We're seeing some really exciting Weyland cards, a neutral card, and a brand new mechanic called Expendable, which I am incredibly excited about, so huge shout out to the nice folks in Null Signal Games for giving us these cool things that we're able to talk about here on the channel. And talk about is what we're going to do. If you're not familiar to these sort of videos, we're going to spend a couple minutes now going forward, basically going through these cards one by one to talk about what they do, what sort of decks and archetypes we'd be excited to play them within, and also a bit about the lore and flavor that these cards come wrapped within. There are timestamps in the description below, so if there's a certain card you want to hear more about, just go ahead and jump to that. But also, if you enjoy this kind of content, you appreciate this, if you want to leave a like on the video, a comment, subscribe to the channel, share it with a friend, there's so many things you can help do to help this channel grow. And with that, let's dive into our first card. This is a new Weyland agenda. This is called Slash and Burn Agriculture. This is a 4-2 agenda. It's an expansion subtype and also the brand new subtype today, Expendable. And it says you can spend a click and a credit to reveal this agenda from HQ. You trash it to place 2 advancement counters on a card that can be advanced. The flavor text reads, acres of rainforest live or die by quarterly revenue projections. This is the first Expendable card we're going to see today, and I'm really excited about this sort of idea. A modal card. This is both an agenda and largely an operation, all tied into a single package, and it's up to the hopefully discerning corporation to understand whether they want to hold this for a better day or score this out right then and right there. Now, I'll be honest, I don't actually know much more about Expendable as a subtype. These cards were given to me with very little explanation besides it's a new mechanic. I think you'll figure it out. And I think Expendable is really easy to understand. I just can't tell with any confidence whether this is something we're going to see across all factions or whether this is going to be very uniquely a Weyland thing. Based off of the name and how it works, I'm kind of leaning towards the latter. This is going to be a unique Weyland thing, but we'll see if there's going to be more Expendable cards within this set or even across even more of Netrunner, which I'm all for. I'm really into this mechanic. Now, before we dive deeper into the mechanics of this card, I thought we could take a second to talk about the theme that's on display here. And Slash and Burn Agriculture is a very real thing. Doing some basic research, I was actually really surprised to see that this was a much older thing than I thought it was. This sort of agricultural practice goes all the way back to the Neolithic ages. In short, what's happening here is that if you need to have some agricultural land, and specifically if you live somewhere where the quality of the soil might not be too great, a pretty reasonable practice seems to be going to an area that has a lot of vegetation, clear cutting down all the vegetation, waiting for it to dry up a bit, and just lighting it on fire. Once that fire, hopefully a controlled fire, burns out, you're left with some new land, which is actually a very hospitable place to plant agriculture. The nutrient-rich layer from all the stuff you've burnt out is really good for plants. And on top of that, you've probably burnt out all the pests and all the weeds. So this is actually a really good way to get good farmland from locations that probably don't have the best soil to work with. Again, this is something that's been happening for a really long time, all the way back to the Neolithic ages, and is still being used largely widely today. On this art, which is fantastic art by Vitaly Ostashchenko, you get to see the Weyland Corporation just bulldozing through the Amazon rainforest. And again, that name does sound a bit ghoulish and massively unsustainable. You do see here, I think it's absolutely fantastic. You see plumes of colorful birds being displaced from their environment, which is being absolutely destroyed. And I think that's an important thing to understand as well. Slash and burn agriculture can actually be kind of environmentally sound, or at least sustainable enough in small quantities. It is not something that needs to be or should be done at a large scale. scale. You cannot just destroy the rainforest. Interestingly, on a small scale, when this is done, generally the land that's been slashed and burned and turned into farmland eventually will become infertile once again. And so the folks that burnt that will go find a new patch of land. They will do the same process over and over again. And eventually the originally burnt patch will grow back up to be whatever it was originally, an Amazon forest. And at that point, you can kind of, you have a closed circle of things that you can burn down to get good farmland. I don't think Weyland is doing that sustainably. I think, again, it seems like quarterly projections, they just need more land for farming, for whatever development they're doing. When it comes down to the Amazon itself, in fact, this is used commonly within that area. Here says, in the Amazon, many people such as the Yanomami also live off the slash and burn method because the Amazon has actually pretty poor soil quality. So one of the best ways to make that quality of the soil palatable is just to burn stuff on top of it. So this is something that is done. As much as it seems pretty rough to burn down the jungle. Yeah, apparently it's a much more sustainable practice than it might have sounded like. I think I just endorsed burning down the rainforest, and that's kind of a weird look. So we got a brand new card here, an expendable card, and it's a really cool marriage of both an agenda and an operation. Your choice of how you want to play it. And I think to discuss this, we're going to break this down in two halves. First, we'll talk about the agenda, and then we'll talk about the operation. Firstly, as an agenda, it's really bad. It's just not good. It's a 4-2 agenda that when you score it out does nothing. And I don't think that is meant to be I still think this is a very powerful card. It's just any point in time where you have to score this thing out, it's going to feel like a compromise. Currently, Weyland is playing some of the most aggressive, some of the most rushy decks that are full of these sort of agendas that when scored, do something. Either pay you out handsomely, they push you forward, they give you the ability to get cards from your deck to pull up your combos, all this sort of stuff you're okay with doing in Weyland. But scoring out a 4-2 agenda that is nothing is pretty rough. Now, again, I don't think that's a reason not to play this card. There are some classical precedents in Netrunner of cards kind of like this, you could argue. An APD contract was a very popular card back in the day, and this is a very different beast. This card costs 4 credits for the runner to steal. That is a defensive agenda. It works anywhere on the table or on central servers, and this saw play across most corporation decks for a long time. And the thing is, if you played back then, you remember that sort of the turns where the corporation went out of their way and they felt, great, I didn't want to score this, but I have to because it's the only agenda I have, or I have a scoring window. And spending, again, 5 clicks to score out just 2 points that doesn't do anything and doesn't impact the board state. As a runner, you let out a sigh of relief. And I think you're going to get to the exact same spot here with Slash and Burn Agriculture. In any matchup where the corporation feels like they have to score this out, that's obviously the best thing for the runner because they could have scored out a much scarier agenda. That being said, though, I do think there are going to be some board states where scoring this thing out is the right thing to do. It's just going to feel bad because it doesn't do anything. You want to avoid it. And luckily, this card gives you so many good reasons why you want to avoid it. And they're really exciting reasons because if you're not scoring this out, it's going to stay in HQ and you're going to take on some risks here. And I do think you want to take some risks on here because this card does a lot of work from HQ. Again, expendable. You can play this as an operation, largely. You can pay a credit, you can pay a click, you put this into Archives face up after it resolves, no different than it was an operation, and for that incredible cost, you get to put 2 advancements on a card that can be advanced. It's weird. There's not a lot of text, but let me tell you, that is a very powerful ability, and I think we can say with some certainty that's a very powerful ability. Look at Seamless Launch. This card came out in System Gateway and has been one of the more powerful cards from that set for a long time. To place 2 advancements on a single card that wasn't installed this turn. So this one on its own is a bit more limiting than the operation, the sort of agenda operation we have, but this card you will see everywhere across both standard and startup format. This card has seen competitive, consistent play across every single faction in Netrunner. In fact, notably, Weyland is probably one of the last factions that I've seen Seamless Launch in any sort of like high competitive standard. In fact, just this last weekend, an op deck came 1st, 2nd, and 3rd at the West Coast Canadian Nationals playing Seamless Launch within Weyland. It's actually something quite notable. You haven't seen it a lot there. Weyland largely isn't playing a lot of 4-2 agendas. They play mostly 3-2 agendas with a bit of a fast advance threat. So you largely didn't need Seamless Launch, but let me tell you, getting additional counters on the Project Atlas is one of the most important things, and that's largely why Seamless Launch exists within this deck. And I think that's a really cool thing too. Having access to Slash and Burn Agriculture means in faction now we can play 3 Seamless Launches in our deck, if you want to call them that. And that might actually open up the amount of agendas that you might see being played across Weyland decks. There's a whole bunch of 4-2 agendas that just see no play because Weyland is all about going fast and maybe fast advancing. So cards like Armed Intimidation as a 4-2, you barely see this hit a table. And not only can you play this a bit more easily, this is a card that very specifically you want to score out with having more clicks left in the turn. So if you want to do something like install advance, once your next turn starts, you can go ahead and slash and burn this and then still have 2 clicks left to capitalize on whatever miserable choice the runner has made. Sounds absolutely fantastic. And of course, it's still really good with Project Atlas. You want to get more counters, you get all that benefit from seamless launches. SDS drone deployments, even 5-3 agendas, allow you to score these out in a bit more aggressive and interesting way that the runner might not expect. And it is worth noting, as small as this is, seamless launch and akin slash and burn agriculture is technically an economy card. You're getting 2 advancements for a single click for a single credit. That does save you some amount of money, obviously saves you a fair bit of time, and that's incredibly important. But just the way that this impacts how you can score out 4 2s on the table, that you can put a 4-2 behind a piece of ice and it looks equally like an asset and an upgrade is kind of the safety you get from seamless launch. And having that within Weyland is incredibly cool, and I'm excited to see if that's going to open up more types of agendas within some of the Weyland decks. But of course, this card isn't seamless launch because it's missing that very important clause on seamless launch that says you cannot advance a card that's been installed this turn. This does not care. You have to put advancements on a card that can be advanced, but it doesn't matter if you've installed that card this turn. So not only is this all the beauty of seamless launch, it's a fast advance tool. If you have a 3-2 agenda like an above the law, you install the above the law, you advance it once, and you slash and burn. So you just scored a 3-2 all in a single turn. The runner had no ability to interact with that, and you are off to the races. You were just getting not only is it seamless launch, but it is some more fast advance. We've actually seen a very similar card to this across Weyland for a long time now. That's Audacity. This is a staple card within Weyland. You do see it out of faction as well, but Audacity is in a lot of ways a very similar thing to slash and burn. It says you can only play this if there are 3 cards in HQ, and as an additional cost, you have to trash every single card from HQ. We're going to get to this, but of course, the cost of slash and burn, of basically saying to the runner, there's an agenda in archives, go get it, that is incredibly high cost. And Audacity largely too has a high cost associated with it. You have to throw out your whole hand. Now, sometimes that means there's going to be an agenda in archives. Again, if you're holding an agenda on top of the Audacity, it's hard to separate those two. Everything goes or nothing goes. But Audacity sees a lot of play for a couple reasons. Firstly, it's important to understand that Weyland decks are really good at going fast, but eventually the runner does catch up. So a lot of Weyland decks have classically what's called the 5-point problem. You can get to 5 points, no problem. But at that point, the runner is probably now set up. They have their economy, they have their breakers. So getting that 6th and 7th point is kind of difficult. So Audacity shows up often as a one of in most Weyland decks, so that as soon as you get to 5 points, it doesn't matter if you're discarding a whole hand full of agendas, you install a 3-2 agenda, advance Audacity, and you win the game. Again, the cost on Audacity and equally the cost in slash and burn don't matter if the game is over. And so just on that basis alone, if you're playing slash and burn like an Audacity and you don't care about the downside, it's not a real downside. Of course, there's a huge difference here. Slash and burn is an agenda. So if the runner accesses it, they steal it, which is very different from Audacity, which if they access it, they just get scared and understand the game is not going to be on for that much longer. But that might mean that you have to be a bit more defensive and you're not able to leave central servers open as openly as you might in some Weyland Rush decks. I think there's something here to be said about what I'm going to call card compression. This is like an unfortunate nature of Netrunner, is that you're pretty restricted on what you can play in a corp deck. As a corporation, there's a bunch of things you need to do inherently when building a deck. You have to play a certain modicum of agenda points, so generally somewhere between 18 and 21 agenda points have to go in your deck, depending on your deck size. Then on top of that, you're probably going to have to run some amount of ice. Then you have to run some amount of economy cards so you can res that ice, let alone score out the agendas. You're probably going to run your 3 spin doctors as you usually do, and you're going to have to run some amount of win condition, whether it's defensive upgrades or proactive ways to attack the runner. Generally just economy and ice does not win a lot of Netrunner games. And at that point, you might realize you only have a couple card slots left to work with because there's so much basic work you have to do anyways. So yeah, sometimes things can be hard to get that creative spice into your corp deck. And this is SSL endorsement. This card is currently banned in the standard format. It's been banned for a long time, but it's a pretty good example of a card that does 2 things at once. This was a really valuable card because not only did it possibly take up to 9 points of your agendas within any deck, when this card was scored or stolen, you got 9 credits. So not only was this one of your agenda slots in your deck, it was also one of your economy slots in your deck. So you kind of, 2 stones, 1 bird, you got a lot done and still had extra slots to work with. So maybe those extra slots that you didn't have to spend on economy that you spent on the SSL endorsement allows you a bit more flexibility with deck construction. I think to some extent you could see that the same way when it comes to slash and burn agriculture. It is not only 6 points worth of agendas potentially in your deck, but it's also some fast advance tools, some on-tempo ways to score agendas, and that might open up a couple more slots so you can do something more ambitious with deck building, and I think everyone's going to find that to be pretty exciting. Again, of course, there's a big difference between this card and Audacity, and I do think you want to play this card and Audacity and potentially some decks. The idea is that you can play maybe 2 Audacities, 3 Slash and Burns, and have 5 fast advance pieces without spending any influence. That sounds really attractive. So again, you can do both, but it does give you some card compression and get more slots out of your deck, which I very much value. Now, of course, Slash and Burn, it's worth noting, it allows you to advance anything that is advanceable. It doesn't have to be agendas. Now, I do think those use cases that are not agendas are going to be pretty slim. I don't think forfeiting an agenda and putting in archives obviously is worth 2 advancements on your Pharaohs. I don't think that's going to work out. And while you can get some cheap advancements on something like a reversed accounts, I think it's going to be pretty rare for that to be the right play. It's a bit more efficient than advancing it itself, but there's a pretty steep cost to it. So yeah, I don't know if you want to do that. Now, speaking of steep cost, maybe that's the elephant in the room here. There's a really steep cost to using Slash and Burn. Not only do you have to take an agenda from your hand and put it into archives, you have to tell the runner that agenda is in archives. And Audacity, as we talked about, has a steep cost associated. That's your entire hand. Again, if you win the game, that's not a real cost, but there are a lot of times where an Audacity will be played and there will be agendas in hand anyways. The idea is that you're holding onto a global food initiative that you have really no interest in scoring out as a blank 5-2, if you want to call it that. So you're okay forfeiting this for the cost of getting a really nice Project Atlas with some counters on it. That's a fair trade in a lot of matchups. The question is, how can we play this more safely? And there are actually a fair few ways to do it. The obvious one that's going to be the easiest to play is you're probably already playing 3 Spin Doctors in most decks you're playing. If there's a Spin Doctor on the table, Slash and Burn is relatively safe. I'm really interested to see whether the play patterns around Spin Doctor are going to change against Weyland decks. Whether there's a Spin Doctor early, whether you want to ice it up, I think that's a much more interesting. But whether runners feel like they need to pressure the Spin Doctors with a bit more immediacy because they understand the Slash and Burn will happen, and making that Slash and Burn a risky Slash and Burn is probably worth those 2 credits if you want to threaten that Doctor. You have other tools as well to kind of recur agendas that you've thrown into archives, but none of them are at instant speed. So something like Drudge Work does see play mostly in op decks modernly, but in standard, this allows you to spend a click to get that agenda back into your deck and get credits. So if you're using that Slash and Burn for tempo potentially, and you have a click left on your turn, otherwise it's going to have to hang out in archives for an entire turn. That might be hard. I think we're also seeing a bit of Gatekeeper sneak into some of the outfit decks as a nice little surprising on-tempo code gate with some big strength. That might be a nice way to protect archives if you're really worried, but I don't know. Maybe you just want to go faster in a remote server. Now, I don't want to underrepresent this because it's a really intimidating cost. And I think a lot of players might see the Slash and Burn agriculture cost and want to do nothing with it. Telling the runner where the agenda is that they can run no problem is a big issue potentially. We're seeing cards like Reprise. This I haven't see a lot of play, but if corporations, if Weylands are very consistently showing you where the agenda is, this does look a lot nicer. We've seen the upcoming console Hermes from Mercury. This looks really quite good. And having the ability to fire your Hermes when and if you can consistently, that's pretty frightening for a corporation. And I think maybe the worst contributor here is Mad Dash. I feel like the Mad Dash meta competitively has died down a fair bit, but this card is still going to be around after the rotation. So understanding that there's a 3-point play, a run on archives, that might be a huge disaster for a corporation deck. So understanding how prevalent these abilities are is definitely going to make the Slash and Burn more or less interesting. But I think the thing that I'm most interested with comes from the future of cards we might not have seen yet. Because there's always been this underlying idea for Weyland where you can tell the runner where the agendas are right now, but they might not want to run them. The sort of Weyland threat is something we haven't really seen for the last little while, but it's something that was present when I learned Netrunner many, many years ago. Just as a brief shout out here, I guess, if you know that you're going to put some Slash and Burns into archives, you can always go ahead and put some like upgrades on archives. I'd take any opportunity to put upgrades on archives because it's such a goofy play, and this is something you go out of the way to do. If they're going to run archives, they're taking 2 tags. That might be deterrent enough, but I think seeing what the deterrents are going to look like in the future set is so exciting to me. There's a big mechanic. The marquee mechanic for the new set is something called Threat. This is something that was explained just recently in one of the update articles, and Threat is a mechanic that scales, or basically it turns on based on how many agenda points are in any player's score area. So as an example here, we saw a teeny. It is a pretty nasty piece of ice, and here it says Threat 3. That means that this text will be online if one player has at least 3 points of agendas in their score area. We haven't seen any Weyland cards with the word Threat on it. And I think we could see Weyland or NBN cards related to tags or meat damage, anything like that, that have some threat threshold. So the runner understands, if I run archives right now to steal that agenda, that slash and burn I know that's in there, threat will suddenly be turned on or turned higher to the point that I'm worried. And that sort of Weyland threat, where you can tell the runner very confidently there's an agenda in here and they choose not to hit it, is something I've dearly missed within the Weyland card pool. Otherwise, cards like Punitive Counterstrike, they don't really work well exactly with 2-pointers, but this is what I'm talking about. Back in the day, if you could trick the runner into stealing a 3-pointer, sometimes you could put a 3-pointer on the table and they don't want to run it. One of my favorite cards, this hasn't been in standard for a long time. The mid-season replacement says, play only if the runner stole an agenda on their last turn. There was a big trace. The difference in the trace gave the runner that amount of tags, so the runner understood. You could put an agenda on the table, a face-up agenda, and score it without ice, and the runner would say, I want nothing to do with that right now. I'll come back later. I'm really hoping that we see something like that with Slash and Burn, where even if you understand where the agenda is, you don't want to touch it. So modernly, we don't have too much that fits into the camp. Whether you want to spend a lot of influence on something like a distributed tracing to give a tag, that might be a tall ask. I do think single tag avoidance is pretty alive and well in startup, but not very alive and well in standard. So whether you want to pair that like something like a retribution, I think that's interesting. I do think inherently program destruction gets a lot more deadly with the rotation upcoming, but we'll see what it takes for that to be scary. But I'm really hoping for something that says, stay out. Otherwise, as a shout out, you have access always to digital rights management, whether you want to pull your fast advance piece to hand and hold it in hand. Hopefully the threat keeps them out of HQ, because otherwise, yeah, they're going to come in and they know where the agendas are. I think one big shout out here for a combo that I think is going to be pretty prevalent as a way to use Slash and Burn with very little threat. If you're playing Op, which allows you to get a card at instant speed when you've trashed another card. So the idea is that if you have an AZF protocol, you can do install, advance, slash and burn. You throw out the slash and burn, and then when the AZF is scored, you're required to trash one of your installed cards. If you can have a 1-coster that you can trash that's rezzed, that means you can use the Op's ability to, at instant speed, install and res a 0-coster from your deck. So you can go ahead and get a Spin Doctor right then and right there, which means that slash and burn in archives is entirely safe. I think that's going to be a pretty common play pattern potentially in these decks as a way to use slash and burn with minimal risk. And it's really fun to talk about risk when it comes to slash and burn, because there's just a lot of risk here. I think that's like a really exciting part about this card, is that inherently it's an agenda that you're incentivized to keep in HQ until the time is right. That's interesting in a couple ways. Firstly, it's fast advance that all runners can interact with. That is something that's potentially pretty annoying for a lot of runners. If you're playing as maybe a criminal and you see there's a biotic labor in hand, you're playing in startup, there's not a lot of ways for you to stop this from happening. If the corporation draws an agenda, you can't lock R&D and see every card they draw. They're going to pay 7 credits. They're going to score some points. And if you're not playing, again, an Anarch that can trash some things that they access with an Imp or a Carnivore, you're in a pretty ugly spot. So now we have a fast advance piece that is attached to accessing. If you can access and steal the agenda, you turned off the fast advance piece. So now cards like Dockland's Pass, anything that sees a lot of cards, I think also Mercury is going to enjoy this a lot, that it might be a way that you can favorably interact with fast advance and not feel helpless. Of course, I'm interested to see on the corp side whether losing a slash and burn agriculture, which represents not only losing 2 points, but also losing a key fast advance piece, whether that's going to be absolutely gutting, whether that's going to be win more for the runner, lose more as a corporation. There's going to be a lot of emotions that we might have to work through here, but a very powerful effect. And I think is a really strong start for Expendable as a card that gives you a lot of options. Whether you do want to score this out as a blank 4-2, that might be the right play. Understanding when that is the right play is going to be really interesting, or whether you want to kind of push your luck a bit, hold this in HQ, protect HQ at all costs, because you can fast advance if you get a nice 3-2 off the top of R&D. Very powerful ability, and I'm super excited to throw this into archives. Next up, our next Weyland card is Cybersand Harvester. This is a 2-cost asset. It's not unique. You can have as many of these on the table as you want. And it says whenever you res a piece of ice, place 2 credits on this asset. Now you can spend those hosted counters to pay install costs. So if you want to get more ice on a single server, that's going to be cheap to free. That's great. And at instant speed, during any paid ability window, you can always trash this to take all credits off of this asset. 4 trash cost is a lot. The runner, again, you might not give them the ability to trash this. You can always crack this to get the money off of it before they could even touch this thing. And the flavor text says, nothing's as precious as a hole in the ground. It's only 2 influence, which I think is a really big part of this card, because this card is incredibly flexible across all factions. And really quickly, when it comes to the flavor here, I can't really figure out what Cybersand is. doesn't seem to be a real thing, but what I find fascinating about this card is that we've seen so many depictions of Weyland mining the physical world, extracting resources however they can at almost any cost. And this is very interestingly the first card I believe we've seen where we're extracting resources from cyberspace. Whatever valuable thing that you can generate credits from that exists when ice is being rezzed, that's kind of I don't know, pretty sci-fi in some ways, but that's really fascinating. And I don't think we've ever seen this arm of Weyland that is, doing industrious work within cyberspace. So I gotta be honest, out of all of the spoiler cards we've ever had on this channel, I think this is one of the most difficult cards to evaluate. It does a lot. It has a lot of clauses going on. It has that beautiful whenever clause, which classically in Netrunner cards is one of the most busted things potentially. It is something you can use at instant speed, and very, very importantly, it mimics one of the most powerful cards in the history of Netrunner. This is Estelle Moon. Estelle Moon has rotated now, but she was banned for a long time within the standard format. But Estelle says whenever you install a card into a server, you can put a power counter on Estelle. And very similarly to the Cybersand, the runner is never able to trash Estelle. They're going to want to try to run it to force you to crack this, but you're always guaranteed your value. And Estelle says you draw a card and gain 2 credits for every power counter on Estelle. So this card allowed you to put out a bunch of assets and then reload at instant speed and then put out more assets. It was really obnoxious. And again, the runner could never stop you. They had to spend time to figure out how to pressure her, but at the end of the day, you still got your benefit. And Cybersand Harvester largely looks the same way. Whenever clause, the runner is never able to stop you from doing this, you're going to be guaranteed some value. But of course, putting cards on the server is something that you're in full control over. Rezzing your ice is not something you're in full control over. In fact, the runner is mostly in control of that clause. And that's where I think this card gets a bit more interesting, and it's kind of hard to entirely figure out how this is going to work. In fact, I think that if this card is going to find success in Weyland, it's going to usher in kind of a new paradigm, because I don't think this has a very obvious inclusion in the sort of Weyland rush decks. This is the sort of thing that you have to protect while also doing other stuff and building up remote servers, the sort of 2-server problem. And I think this is a really good way to push Weyland into that. We're going to dive a bit more into this issue by, I think, starting with a practical example of how this card might play out on just about any board state. So imagine it's turn 1 and we open with the Cybersand Harvester in our hand and say like an ice wall. Say we want to invest in this thing as soon as possible. So our first turn, we get an ice wall on the table on our remote server. We put the Cybersand Harvester behind it and say we click for a credit. Let's say we play a hedge fund. Now it's back to the runner. Now they might think there's something valuable in the remote server, maybe a Rashida Yahim, and they want to force us to res our ice. So first click, they barrel into the remote server. Now this is one of the beauties of the Cybersand Harvester, is that it is a card that you're guaranteed to get value from. We only are going to res this right before during the same paid ability window when we're going to res ice, which means at a minimum, as long as we have 2 credits to spare more than the ice that we're resing, we're always going to at least break even on the card on its own. We res for 2, we res the ice wall for 1, we gain 2 credits on this. Now, of course, you want your card to gain more than just break even. You probably want to generate about 6 credits off of this to offset the 2 credits you paid to res it. That kind of makes it akin to a hedge fund. Your mileage may vary, but at least at a minimum, you don't res this and you don't spend any money until this is going to do something. That's a really good start. But now we reveal that this is a Cybersand Harvester. If the runner can get through the ice, they can get through the ice, and then there we have another option. Either we can allow the runner to pay 4 credits to trash this, or if we really need the money, we can always go ahead and trash this to gain 2 credits. That's actually an interesting choice. If the runner wants to contest this, they need to make sure they're accessing with at least 4 credits. Otherwise, we can just say, you can touch that. You're not going to trash that. And at that point too, we can decide, is the money better for us? Or is it more important that the runner doesn't have money? I think in the early game here, it's kind of up to you to figure it out based off of your hand and whether you're going to need the money for the next couple plays. But it's at least an interesting decision that the corporation has control over that conversation. But more realistically, we've just resed an ice wall. We've showed what we're protecting as a Cybersand Harvester, and the runner just ends the run. And from that point, the runner goes on with their turn. We start our next turn and we go ahead and start icing up central servers. Let's put an Afshar on HQ, something on R&D. And now the runner's in a really weird spot because they understand anytime that we force the corporation to res a piece of ice, we're giving them 2 free credits. That's whenever. That's a very powerful ability. So that's kind of up to them at this point to maybe not run anymore. If they can't directly threaten the Cybersand Harvester, and mind you, this card is pretty good into pinhole threading because you can always crack it at instant speed to get your money back, they might want to just do nothing for a bit and just sit back and set up because they understand their early aggression is going to give you credits. Now, again, that might not be a reason to not do early aggression. Corporations might be a bit porous in the early game. There might be a couple agendas in HQ if they're not going anywhere, so there's some good reason to do that. But understand, For the Cybersand Harvester to be good here, the runner has to be running. So we need to make the runner want to run. We have a couple ways to do that, I guess. If we're a fast advanced deck and we're just sitting back and we're scoring out cards from hand with biotic labors, maybe some slash and burn agricultures, the runner might understand they can't afford to sit back. But otherwise, maybe they can. And that's the sort of issue here, is generally a lot of corporations only have one scoring remote server. And if our remote server is the thing that holds the Cybersand Harvester, which we need to keep on the table while we res ice, the runner doesn't have a lot of incentive to run this server with the Harvester in it, so they probably won't. And this is where I think we have to pivot to build a second remote server. That way we can put something into that remote server that might be an agenda, and the runner might think, I have to run that. And that's when we can force to get value out of the Harvester. Again, this is what I'd call the two remote problem, and it's something that we haven't largely seen in Weyland. In fact, not a lot of Weyland decks are building a second remote server. We've seen a lot of cards like this throughout the history of Netrunner, things like synth DNA modification. I think this is a really good example. It's a card that has a lot of value attached to it. It's a card that cares about ice, but it's a card that you're probably going to have to protect. Now, this thing has a lower trash cost, and there's an argument that maybe 4 trash costs is a deterrent enough that you don't have to ice it up at all, if well. But the idea is that the synth DNA modification is a card you have to protect, but you still need to build another server that also well protects whatever you're trying to score out in it, or whatever acid or Fienchen Keeling you're trying to protect. And that largely hasn't come to fruition in Netrunner. It just feels like you're asking a bit too much for the corporation, and they have a bit more direct ways to generate value or generate some sort of pressure. But I'm not too negative about it, because from what we've seen so far from a lot of the spoilers, we've seen a lot of cards that are directly encouraging the second server amount of play. This was just revealed today. Atea, the new Jinteki identity, allows you to, on tempo, put things in a second remote server. It highly encourages you to build 2 remote servers. And this is the sort of deck potentially that I'm really excited to play Cybersand Harvester in. Something that is naturally encouraging us to get more things on the table, so we're more likely to get unconditional value from the Harvester. It's not just a Harvester on the table, it's Harvester and something else. And with 2 influence, that might be a really good start. In fact, I think 2 influence here is huge, because if you ask me, this is an HB card. There's so much value you can get from this from HB decks. Just about all the HB card pool modernly really works with this thing well. Let's look at ASA group over here, which allows us to, for a single click, very similar to the new Jinteki ID, build iced remote servers, and as many as we want. So for a single click, we get the Harvester up, we've iced it up. Next turn, we're getting a new remote server with something in it. The runner probably wants to run that. We res the Harvester. Maybe we have a second Harvester on the table. Mind you, it's not unique. And we're generating a lot of clickless economy. Something right now that I think a lot of the HB decks are kind of lacking. Money up front is really nice. We have so many other things that work really well with it. Wave, again, very cheap, easy to res, gets another ice out of our deck, so we're set up to go to get more ice on the table. Harmonics work really well. We have the Elevagao bifurcation that allows us to de-res stuff, so we can re-res some of that cheap ice, get some more harmonic value, get some more cyber sand out of it. Again, of course, more harmonics, bloop, another de-res effect. Magnet, looking really good right now into the meta upcoming with Arasana, the new shaper identity with all the Trojans. So there's a lot of stuff right here where you can get a lot of immediate value. And again, not unique. Whenever claws, there's a lot of ice you can be resing in HB while you're going horizontal. It's something that we haven't seen in Weyland so far. I think we can see it, but I think it's a very natural fit outside of Weyland, and I'm interested to see how we can bring this into Weyland and build that 2 or multi-server game. Now, largely, we've been talking about the ability to trash this thing to get access to those credits. That's the easiest way to get value from this. Obviously, it's trashed and then, it's gone, but that's money you can use for anything. Otherwise, you can use these credits up front to pay for install costs, and that's really nice. It means that you don't have to destroy this while you're still getting more ice on the table, which means ideally more Cybersand Harvester credits. That's pretty cool. And inherently, there's some cards within the Weyland card pool that will incentivize that sort of play pattern. Surveyor used to be such a meta force many years ago. You haven't seen a lot of it in the standard format right now, but it's a card that multiplies its value based off of the tallness of the server, so a really natural include. Border control as well, a very powerful ice almost unconditionally, but if you put this onto a really tall server, it multiplies the value of the server. So it's one of the best 3rd or 4th ice you can put on any server because it's kind of akin to putting 3 to 4 more ice on that server itself. So a nice way to go tall. Whether you want to go even taller than that and consider a Jinja City Grid, that's kind of up to you. But you still have to remember that if the Harvester is in the City Grid remote server, the runner's probably not going to run it, which means as soon as you show what that is, they're probably not going to go further in the server and you're going to deny yourself credit. So again, second server problem is kind of how I define this. Now, what I think is also really exciting is that while the Cybersand Harvester is kind of up to the runner because they're largely allowing you to res your ice, there were classically a lot of cards in the Weyland card pool back in the day that would make the Cybersand Harvester a bit of a more proactive economy card. We don't have any of these cards right now, but I'm excited to see whether we're going to see stuff within the rest of this set or the rest of the entire cycle. But if you look back all the way at things like Amazon Industrial Zone, that allowed you to install and res immediately cards to save credits, this would be a 5 credit value card attached to the Cybersand Harvester. Obviously, you're giving up what the ice is and the surprise, but that's a lot of money, and you'll get access to the Harvester right away. Other cards like Surat City Grid allow you to chain res a bunch of stuff all at once, so suddenly the Harvester can be a burst economy card that's pretty powerful. And even just cards like Executive Bootcamp, which are sometimes don't seem very powerful, but this allows you to res a card, including ice, at the start of your turn for 1 credit cheaper. So savings up front, and the Harvester will begin harvesting regardless of what the runner is doing on their side of the table. That actually might be pretty attractive. Even cards like Chimera, which constantly de-res themselves, become a lot more palatable when you're getting 2 credits and basically rebating the res cost itself. I think that could be quite fun, and we haven't seen a card like this in a really long time. Now, of course, too, this card has some interesting interactions with Op. I think every Weyland card gets analyzed within Op itself as something very, very interesting. Of course, this has a trash cost on it, but very importantly, Cybersand Harvester, of course, you want to be resing a lot of ice to get value from this quickly, and Op is one of the best Weyland identities to be resing ice quicker than you think they can. Again, with Op, once a card is trashed, you can go search your deck for a card 1 cost cheaper and install it and res it for free, which means once you res your border control, you get 2 credits. Then you crack the border control, you use your Op ability to go get a 3 cost card, that card is resed, you've now got 2 more credits. You've got 2 credits worth of resing ice, but you didn't have to pay more money to res that ice. You just slightly, downshifted your ice a bit. That's a very natural inclusion in Op decks. The Cybersand Harvester will accelerate a bit faster than you might think. I think that's really exciting. And of course, if you don't want to wait for the runner to run to your ice, you have access to things like Spheticor Excavator to trash even assets into ice, get that stuff resed for free, or extract. That becomes a very valuable economy play, and you get a lot more flexibility on how you can fire your Harvester. Incredibly notable too, this will be the only card within the standard card pool we've seen so far that is an unconditional 2-cost card you can trash at any paid ability. That sort of thing is just very universally interesting for Op decks. Now, this has to have credits on it for you to be able to trash it. So you have to have resed at least a piece of ice, and this has to see it, and there has to be credits on this. You can't trash it for no reason. But that means that we have a way at any paid ability to go find a 1-coster from our deck. Interesting to see what 1-costers we're going to get value from, whether we just want to get a Malip or Data Vault before we score out an agenda. That's always interesting. Whether we want to crack this at the start of turn paid ability window before start of turn, so we can get something on the table that cares about start of turn. So guaranteeing a wall-to-wall, that could be quite nice. Getting an urban renewal down early so that the power counters come off this faster, that's a cool play in standard. Or just getting a Bladderwort on the table so you can do net damage. Maybe. That seems a bit difficult because you're going to get credits from the Harvester, but you have this option. And I think anytime there's a 1-coster you have an interest to get at instant speed, this is now the flexible way to do it. And I think that's very, very valuable for that Op toolbox kind of combo list. So again, such an interesting card. The Whenever clause, it has an ability to produce a lot of credits. But if this is the only thing on the table, I don't know why the runner is going to run, so you have to force them to run. That probably means second server. Again, something that's so easy out of faction, and in Weyland, I'm very interested to see how the decks might warp around that. Whether 4 cost is enough that you can just put this on the table uniced, it might just be, because again, if the runner does trash this, you're still going to get your value from it. It just kind of gives them a thing that they have to do, an errand that they have to run before they're really excited to run into some ice. And again, as spoiler season goes on, we're seeing so many other cards that kind of support this like 2 server thing that makes us really valuable out of faction. I was going to say that this card seems really nice in a deck like Replicating Perfection, where you can't challenge the assets before you challenge the central servers. And while this card doesn't exist, it rotated. We just saw this spoil today, a front company. A nice way, again, for 2 influence that you can force runners into some of your central ice before they end up running your Harvester. And that might be a nice way in just about any faction to guarantee some value. So super cool. Whether it's exactly Estelle Moon or not, I think we're going to find out, but potentially a very powerful card as long as you can set up a board state where this is favorable. It's free money. And that should bring us to our final Weyland card. That is Treeline. This is our second expendable card. 4 cost gets you this barrier, expendable subtype. It says you can advance this ice, and it just gets +1 strength for each advancement on the card. It has a single subroutine, gain 1 credit and end the run. It says the forest around them grew denser with each beat of their heart. And of course, it has that expendable clause on it, so it equally says for a click and 1 credit, you can reveal and trash this ice from HQ to place 3 advancement counters on 1 installed piece of ice. Very notably, 4 strength is a nice start, and this card is only 1 influence, which is actually surprising for how much text is on this card and how interesting and flavorful this card is. In terms of the flavor here, a tree line is a real thing. It is the point in the environment where the trees just cannot grow any further. Sometimes it's like a very clear division that you can see. Sometimes it's a bit more gradual, but as you see here in the image, that's a very stark division where before this point, the trees can grow, and after that point, they just can't grow anymore. Largely because the environment, say, gets too cold, there's too much snow, there's not enough moisture, there's just a change environment, and the trees have to stop somewhere, and sometimes it's really stark. I don't know whether we want to imagine the trees are the server and the nice stuff we're keeping in front, but there's going to be a division, and we're hoping the Weyland dice can at least keep them on one side of that division. So here we have our second expendable Weyland card, and I think when it comes to the excitement of modality in cards, this one might be even cooler, because this card has a lot of options how you want to play it out. On its own, it is a pretty reasonable gear check ice, something you can afford to res early that will keep the runner out until they return with their fractor. Into the mid game, you can continue to advance this thing and it can become pretty sizable in terms of strength. And in the late game, if you draw a copy of this and you don't want to install it, it's not worth it, you can use it as that pseudo operation to bolster your other tree lines, let alone any other ice you have on the table. That sort of option in a single card is really, really flexible. It's really, I think, going to be exciting to play with, and understanding how to use this appropriately for the matchup, for that board state, for that point in time is going to be a lot of fun. Otherwise, here we're actually treading pretty familiar ground when it comes to ice. This is some midpoint between something like an ice wall, the low strength, 1 cost, 1 strength. You can advance this for 1 strength more as many times as you want, barrier, and the firewall, the 5 cost, 5 strength. You can advance this all you want for strength, and the run barrier. Firewall, mind you, hasn't existed in the standard format for a while. It has rotated out. It wasn't the most popular card, but Ice Wall has always remained as a relatively popular card in the format. Just paying 1 credit to end the run in the early game is a nice place to be. Now, when it comes to evaluating new ice, it sometimes becomes a bit of a clinical affair. There's largely 2 angles that you have to look at when evaluating ice. The first is, how strong is that face check? How important is this card if the runner runs into this without having the appropriate breaker? How mean are the subroutines? And then attached to that, how does the existence of this card change how players are willing to smash into things? Basically, does it affect how they play the game? And then once this ice is up, again, if the runner has the breakers down, that subroutine is probably not going to fire anymore. So then it becomes a mathematical equation of how expensive is this thing to go through. If we are resing something for 4 credits and the runner is paying 5 credits to get through it all the time, that's a really good trade. So understanding how taxing a piece of ice is, that's also a very important thing. Now, to start with the face check, this is pretty favorable as well. It kind of falls into the camp of most Weyland ice that's been doing this for a long time coming, is that if a runner runs into this in the early game without a breaker, we get a refund. Functionally, if that subroutine fires, not only do we end the run, but we get a credit back. And there's just so much Weyland ice that comes in at 4 cost where if it fires, you get your credit back. So things like a Hordem, functionally res for 3 credits. Things like an Anvil, you functionally res for 3 credits. So it's fun to see another card within that camp. It's money that you can get back if the face check fires. It encourages you to be a bit aggressive, and you can be a bit faster and looser because your money might be a bit better than it looks. But what I find very puzzling about this, and this actually jumped out, is I don't think there's many other subroutines that are structured like this. If you look at cards like Hordem or Maskarovka, often the credits and the end the run subroutine are separated into 2 separate subroutines. And I would say classically that largely makes more interesting Netrunner. Now, if the runner does eventually have their breaker and they encounter this piece of ice, they're actually given a decision on what they want to break. They can choose to break the end the run subroutine, they can choose to break the credits, they can choose to break both. And sometimes you'll run into board states where you decide, I don't have to keep my money up, so I'm only going to break the end the run. Or sometimes you face check and you think, oh, I want to make sure the corporation doesn't have credits, I'm only going to break the former to deny the credits. And unfortunately, the fact that this has 2 of them on a single subroutine means you're just not going to see that decision ever happen. You are either breaking all the subroutines or none of the subroutines. You're not making a choice about this. So barring the face check, that credit is probably only going to fire once, if at all. A bit strange. I think the only time that that's strictly an upside is if you have something like a Zato City Grid or something that can fire a subroutine, because then you get more for a single subroutine. But when it comes to breaking ice, having it all as one is not a great thing. It's weird. It's very strange. But otherwise, in the early game, if you want to use this as what's called a gear check ice, something that you can put on a remote server to jam an early agenda, something that could potentially protect a central server against some early pressure, I think it actually looks pretty good. The idea is that you could play a tree line for maybe 3 credits on res, or you can play an ice wall. I think oftentimes you can afford those extra 2 to 3 credits to get something a bit bigger that can scale a bit better into the mid to late game. And this card's actually really good at scaling. It can scale relatively well. I think I like that. Now, however, this is a huge caveat, is that understanding how taxing this ice is going to be for most runners to break is a big question mark. When this new cycle launches just next week, we're also going to be experiencing a rotation within the standard format. One of the big sets of cards that are rotating out are these things called the bin breakers or the conspiracy breakers. Specifically, Paperclip has been the de facto fractor for almost every single faction since it's come out in 2016. And this thing is finally leaving, which means there's this huge vacuum and it's hard for us to understand what is the fractor that you're expecting to see from each faction. Largely, it was pretty easy to look at a barrier and you understand just about everyone's going to break this for 3 credits because just about everyone's going to be playing Paperclip. And now it's a bit of a question mark. And I think right now, if we look at some of the options that we're expecting, and mind you, we haven't seen any new icebreakers, any new programs so far in the new set. If we look at some of the options, I think Treeline doesn't look too bad at all. Cleaver is really good at breaking stuff at low strength, but as soon as you have to bring the strength up, you're going to start paying a lot of credits to boost strength. Cleaver on its own, without any support, is going to pay 3 credits to get through a tree line. And from that point forward, anytime you advance this card once, you're costing 2 more credits. So that's a pretty good trade for you. If you get this to 5 strength, the Cleaver is going to go through it each time for 5 credits. That's pretty taxing. And from that point on, the more advancements, the worse it's going to get. So Cleaver without support looks pretty good. If you look at Shaper right now, I think the most common fractor within faction is Propeller, and Propeller can break the tree line for 2 power counters and only 1 credit. But again, as soon as you get that up to 5 strength, so just a single advancement, you're going to have to spend 3 of your 4 Propeller counters to get through a single tree line. So again, so far for 2 factions, that single advancement is looking to be in a pretty good spot. Looking on Criminal right now, I think the most compelling fractor maybe going forward is Tremolo, and Tremolo, exact same math. As soon as you can bring this thing up to 5 strength, you're paying at least 4 credits, maybe 5 to 6, sometimes up to 7, depending on how many cybernetics are installed. But again, looking at the strength there, 5 is a really nice break point here. So whether you want to just get a single advancement on that, maybe you want to play that built to last ability where that first advancement comes in pretty cheap, I think we're looking at a pretty reasonably taxing fractor. Again, until we see what the fractors look like maybe in the new set, this honestly doesn't look too bad. It's also notable that the card is only a single influence. That means you can splash it out of faction relatively easily, and the numbers look okay out of faction. I think you do want to advance this at least once to get the most benefit from it, and the fact that it's expendable here too means you probably want to be playing other advanceable cards, or specifically advanceable ice, so I don't know how often you're going to see it out of faction, but if you're importing Ice Wall, I do think you could at least consider this. Maybe you also want to just consider Palisade, though. It's kind of a similar idea if you're not advancing it. Of course, huge inclusion here in Pravdivos Consulting as just a 1 influence, really taxing card that's going to scale really well the longer the game goes on, just going to get bigger and bigger. One of the downsides of this card is the fact that it only has a single subroutine. That's actually a really annoying thing about this card. And if you've been playing Startup for the last while now, you probably know that a big old advanced barrier is one of the more taxing things in the entire format. I think Pharaohs is doing really well in Startup right now, just because some of the fractors that we looked at don't deal with it relatively well. And then having 3 subroutines on it means that it's really good into anything that cheats around ice and doesn't care about the strength. I think going forward, having a really big, if you want to go out your way to advance your tree line, might not look amazing in the standard format. We're still seeing a lot of things modernly like Botulus. We might even see more of this with the new Shaper Runner who cares about Trojans. I think there's a chance we might start to see a bit more femme fatale with Mercury, who cares about bypass effects, and Banhar is as popular as it's ever been. So the fact that you could advance this thing all the way up to infinite strength and they go through it for a single net damage is probably a bad trade. And if that's the case, you can kind of see where having more subroutines is maybe a bit more taxing, but not the worst thing. But sure, while there'll always be ways in any format to sneak through one big piece of ice with a single subroutine, I think that's okay. Because this card still gives you a lot of avenues to use this intelligently based on the matchup. If they're Banharing, yeah, probably you don't want to triple advance this, but that's kind of the benefit of the modality of this expendable card, is you can choose how to use it when it makes the most sense in the way that it makes most sense. Now, as an expendable ability, you can play this ice from HQ as if it were an operation. For 1 credit, you get 3 advancements. Those 3 advancements have to go on a piece of ice. It can be rezzed or unrezzed. It doesn't have to also be an advanceable ice. There's some small reasons to do that, but that is a lot of click compression to get certain pieces of ice up to power. Now alone, if you're just playing 3 copies of Treeline, at least when you draw your second copy, you have a good enough target. Making a 7 strength barrier is going to be pretty rude if you see your opponent across the other side of the table playing a cleaver. That is immensely expensive to break, and it didn't cost you that much. Again, this is something I emphasize whenever it comes to advanceable ice, and there's still a fair few good pieces of advanceable ice within the format, is spending clicks and credits just advancing your ice is a really expensive line of play. You could be doing anything with those clicks, let alone you are losing credits. You could be clicking for credits, so the time and the credits is very expensive. The fact that we can get 3 advancements for a single click, for a single credit, is exactly the sort of click compression you need to making advancing your ice a bit more palatable. If I'm not mistaken, going forward, there's 7 other advanceable ice in the format, and a lot of the advanceable ice scales differently based on the amount of advancements you have. But if you're already playing some amount of this advanceable ice and you have any interest on getting 3 advancements on it, Treeline is a natural inclusion. Whether you even ever install it, and I do think you want to in the early game, it is a nice way to power up some of this very interesting stuff. We talked about Pharos, which might be pretty good in both formats going forward. The idea that you can spend a single click to get 3 advancements is a dream. That's a 10 strength barrier with 3 subroutines, pretty good against all those cards that we talked about earlier. You have Miss Vingo as well. This one did not show up on that previous page, but this is a card that can go wide. If you find yourself running into a lot of those Banhars or Botulises, this might be a nice way to sneak around that. So that's 3 free subroutines for a single click and a credit. That's okay. But very specifically, there's a bunch of cards that scale well on specifically 3 advancements as well. Things like Aket. This is a pretty reasonable ice in the early game, but if you can get this on the central server and you can get 3 advancements on this for a single click, this is a 5 strength barrier. That could be very hard to break in the upcoming format, but also they just can't break all the subroutines on it. So you get additional value, which might help with your other advanceable ice, let alone your tree lines. It is worth noting that Mouseless, one of the best advanceable ice, is rotating out in this upcoming rotation, so you won't see that one, but you do see cards like Hordem as well. This is a really weird one, and it is worth noting that with the tree line, you can advance a face down piece of ice. And this is the only face down piece of ice that I think you really have to be scared about face checking into. When the Hordem is triple advanced, not only can you not break it with AIs, but the subroutines become massive. You end up resing this thing for free, and then the corporation goes search their R&D for 2 cards and add them into HQ. That's such a disastrous face check that I think I'd actually be a bit apprehensive to face check wildly into unresed ice if I don't have a decoder ready. So you can use that to some extent, but just watch out. That's one of the biggest blowouts. Now, caveat on top of that, while you can go ahead and triple advance some of your face down ice, do watch out with the introduction of Hermes. If you ever triple advance your ice, whether you're paying for it or using your tree line, that can be returned to hand if there's a Hermes and you don't get a resin in time. So that's a big blowout. Maybe you want to be a bit careful in that criminal matchup and only advance things that are resed. Another exciting thing too, as Treeline as that 1 click for 3 advancement, you can actually use that as kind of a tempo play. The idea is that if you have a Hordem on the table and you know the runner, say across the table, has something like a Matryoshka, you can, for a single click, get the Hordem up to speed, which means suddenly the Matryoshka is useless to attack the remote server, so you can install advanced Treeline, the Hordem, and you might be in a good spot. You have to force the runner to go get a real breaker or some other way to get around the ice, and it's cool that you have a surprise way to get 3 advancements quickly, and on certain ice, that can be a really important thing. 3 advancements as well, just universally, is a really nice thing sometimes. Tricolite still exists within the card pool, a way to fast advance by moving some counters away. This is technically, I think, the easiest way to get 3 advancements on a single card. In fact, just a month ago on this channel, we put an introduction to standard deck in which we show a Tricolite Weyland deck, which I think mostly survives rotation. We have to get rid of those Mouselesses, but it's a really nice inclusion to these sort of lists as well, and attached to a pretty okay body. That's a reasonable piece of ice, so it looks pretty good. Whether you want to go a bit deeper into that with Red Planet Couriers, it's kind of up to you. Not my favorite card. And that's Treeline. And I've actually been really excited about this one. Expendable on this thing is such a nice inclusion for an ice that seems pretty reasonable as an early game face check. In the mid game, if you want to advance it using your basic click to advance action, or whether you want to use your other tree lines to get a 7 strength tree line, that's going to be pretty good. And understanding when you want to do which version of that, whether you want more ice or whether you want taller ice, I think that's a really interesting choice to leave to a corporation. And while this is the last expendable card we're talking about today, we have another card to talk about just after this. I think overall, as a mechanic, I'm so excited for the future of Expendable. Just giving more options. Again, that sort of modal card text where you get some player expression. You are allowed with a single card to interact and to react to certain board states, to certain matchups. It's just phenomenal that you get so many opportunities, so many choices on a single card. It's really strange how a card that just says end the run largely on it is that cool to me. But Expendable, really excited to see for the future of this, whether we're going to see it outside of this set or out of the side of this cycle, let alone even outside of Weyland is pretty cool. But we still have one more card to talk about today. This was not a Weyland card, this is a neutral card. And this is the neutral asset B1001. B1001 is unique, costs only 1 credit to res. It's a Biroid and an Enforcer subtype. It's a really weird subtype. There's only one more card with that subtype, and it was never a standard legal card, a very strange card. And it says, at paid ability speed, you can remove 1 tag to end the run. You cannot use this ability during a run on this server. So the server that's holding the B1001. There's a quote supposedly from the B1001 saying, humans crafted me as a lie, but my patron helped me find the truth. This is my gift. A pretty healthy 3 trash cost. And very importantly, this is card 65. This is the last card in the set. So it's cool to see neutral cards. I don't think we saw a lot in the previous set, but the final card within the Automata initiative. In terms of the theme on this one, I was actually surprised to be very wrong where this came from. Immediately when I saw this card, I was thinking, oh wow, that's Mr. X. This is the T00, a pretty similar name, and this is the Nemesis, one of the tyrants from Resident Evil. All the way back from Resident Evil 1998, I was a bit more familiar with the 2019 reboot, and you see this imposing hulking gentleman in a trench coat and a nice little hat, which looks pretty on brand to the B1001 over here. Now, since I've talked to Morgan, the narrative director at Null Signal Games, and I was surprised how wrong I was about this. And the name is probably a bit clear reference. You might have got this sooner than I did. I was a bit embarrassed. This is a very clear reference to a Terminator, specifically the T1000 Terminator. That's why the name is as similar, probably B for Biroid. But this is that shiny silver Terminator that showed up first in Terminator 2 Judgment Day, played by Robert Doggett Patrick. This is that shiny silver Terminator that was unstoppable and could just walk through like metal bars and stuff like that. It reformed. I've been told through playtesting, the playtesting title for this card was just the Terminator, and it stuck and it ended up in the art brief, and this is what we got. Apparently, I think that hat and blazer was Mauricio Herrera's choice, which, again, I don't know if Mr. X was an inspiration here, but absolutely stunning art. Now, shout outs to Mauricio Herrera. This art is absolutely fantastic. Herrera's been doing art all the way since the original 2012 core set, and I just kind of love to see this because I don't think you see it that often, where you see characters, whether they're Biroids or runners, who are kind of inept and caught and looking hapless. I think there's a lot of, people looking cool doing cyberpunk stuff, but just to see here a runner kind of being caught unawares is, I don't know, pleases me to some extent. It's kind of silly. But otherwise, in terms of the card, this is such a weird one. It is a somewhat universal end the run ability, one of the most coveted abilities anyone can have access to, but on a neutral card. That's pretty unheard of. All the way back again, 2012 core set, Nisei Mark II, a 4-2 agenda has hosted agenda counter end the run. That was sort of the holy grail of how you can interact with runs. A very powerful effect, and now technically accessible to anyone. Specifically for neutral, that is really flexible. This doesn't cost influence, and we haven't seen a lot of very powerful neutral upgrades in that sort of defensive way. I'd argue that we've seen no true defensive neutral upgrades at all. I think we've seen some neutral assets, and maybe that's the closest we get. Now, this card has a weird cost. It requires you to remove a tag to end the run. And here, there's going to be a lot of speculation because understanding how free tags are going to be, how easily they can come, what we can do to give runners tags, specifically during runs, that's a bit of a question mark because we haven't seen a lot of the set going forward. We've seen a couple of NBN cards already. They didn't care about tags directly, but largely attached to the standard rotation that this card comes out within, there's a big change into what tags look like. Within the standard format, Hard-Hitting News has been the preeminent tagging card, again, since 2016 when this thing came out. And this thing is rotating. This is the easiest way that corporations can proactively give a large amount of tags to the runner, which would probably be a pretty good hunting grounds for the B1001. And with this card rotating, and not only this card rotating, but one of the, again, biggest tag punishment cards associated in the format, Boom, that can do 2 tags equals 7 meat damage, both of these cards are leaving at the same time. Now, both of these cards leaving at the same time is really interesting. We kind of are getting closer to this like tabula rasa, where NSG can reevaluate the value of what tags can be. Tags could only be so prevalent when there was a card that existed that said 2 tags equals GG. And now without Boom and without Hard-Hitting News, maybe there's going to be more ways to give more tags to the runner, but the punishment won't be as direct. We're seeing less cards that say, again, 2 tags equals GG. We're seeing more cards where it's 2 tags equals, okay, I can fast advance out now. We're still going to have a longer game. So again, maybe with the set and maybe with the future, tags are going to be a bit more common across more factions because the punishment won't be as stark. So punishment like this, which is admittedly a bit convoluted and hard to secure, might make a bit more sense. Very interesting to see what happens here. Otherwise, going forward, the ways that we can give runners a lot of tags that we know of, Amaze Amusements sort of does it, but you'll have to keep the tags for a later run. Things like Check a Scion are probably the most tags you can get on a single card, but it's hard to make this work in a lot of decks, barring Pravdivos Consulting. And of course, we still have access to Mutually Assured Destruction, which can be the most tags in a single card, but I do think you are going to care about board state because inherently the B1001, you are going to have to protect with some amount of board state. But given the cards that we know, what can we do to make this Biroid be able to hunt down some runners? And we have a couple options here. Firstly, of course, there's always going to be ping. The idea is that the runner runs and you res the ping. They have a tag. They go deeper through the server. Maybe they break more ice. And at the last paid ability window, you're able to res the B1001, clear the tag, and end the run. That's going to be a pretty nice surprise. Now, that is not going to last forever. Again, the ping is a one-time shot. You've also cleared the tag for the runner. That's kind of a sharp cost. That is something that the runner generally pays money and time to clear. So you hope that the end of run is worth it. It's not hard to make it worth it. But I think cards like Funhouse are probably going to be the easiest way to get value from this. Funhouse, both in the startup and the standard format, requires the runner to take a tag if they want to pass through this ice. Now we're seeing more cards that allow you to dodge on and counter effects, things like Hush. So there's ways to deal with this, but this is probably the best thing you can line up with your B1001. So if anything is behind this server, you can always clear the tag and end the run as long as you can keep your Biroid bounty hunter safe. Otherwise, it's worth noting that anything that just gives a tag, if it is a subroutine and the subroutine fires, so things like Vasilisa, that could work. Admittedly, at some point, breakers will come into the equation, and there's some really goofy things you can do as well. Now, in terms of the timing structure, it's important to understand you have to remove the tag during a paid ability window. And very importantly, when the runner is accessing cards, there is no more paid abilities. So the last time you can do this is during the 4E step, which is before the runner breaches the server. So say the runner does get into the server and they start accessing cards, and say the first card they access is an upgrade like an increased drop rates and they take the tag, you do not have a paid ability window there to use the B1001. So anything that on access gives a tag, you cannot interact with that. It is a bit too late. Equally, in terms of rules, Acme Consulting, a very powerful ability that can guarantee the runner is considered tagged. The runner is considered to be tagged, but that is not a tag you can remove with the B1001. So you don't get a free end the run on every single server forever, because of course you don't. That would be absurd. Now, very similarly to the Cybersand Harvester we talked about earlier, this card falls into that exact same play pattern that is the 2-server play pattern. Again, we've been seeing a lot of support for this so far, but this is the sort of card where like you have to protect this, but you also want to build a scoring server somewhere else. Now that scoring server can be as simple as just one funhouse. You don't have to go really hard. You just need to get something that will always give a tag, and there's ways to cheat around this. But again, it is another card that supports that same sort of Cybersand Harvester idea of building multiple remote servers. And we talked about a whole bunch of other cards we've seen so far. The new Jinteki ability, not that Jinteki is highly associated with tags. Whether ASA group and HB, again, not a very tag heavy thing, but all these other ways to get more value from building more remote servers. This is another card that slots into that sort of play style pretty well. Again, I don't know whether you can just put this thing out on the table with Near Earth Hub and hope that they don't find it in time and you get to res it at the time that it matters. You probably are going to have to go to the way to build something that protects this thing because it's very powerful once it is online, as long as you have the right ice to support it. Whether you want to go full Glacier and spend all your resources protecting the one B1001 in a remote server, and then just, again, fun housing it out, that's going to be really interesting to see whether that is an actual scoring plan. I'm a bit dubious about it. I think B1001 is very weak to something like a pinhole threading. Again, if you're relying on the funhouse and they don't run that funhouse server, they can cheat their way into that Biroid. So it's going to be pretty tricky. And I think that's where this card is a bit strange. It's probably the easiest to play inside a faction that has access to a lot of tag stuff, things like NBN. But inherently the cost associated to this card is clearing tags. But if the runner has tags, that's something that's annoying that they have to clear anyways. And if you can make them keep those tags, that means you probably have access to a bit more direct win conditions. Things like shipment from Vladisibirsk are probably a better way to capitalize on runner having multiple tags. Now again, protecting an agenda in the remote server, if the runner was going to clear the tags anyways, you are giving them some tempo, but If you knew they were not going to end their turn with tags, maybe the B1001 is a nicer way to capitalize on that. But just watch out. If the runner is massively tagged, you have other ways to close the game that might be a bit more direct. And I think maybe as a neutral way to add tag punishment to any other deck outside of NBN or potentially Weyland, that actually gets pretty interesting. Now, of course, shoutouts for the convoluted op combo, but if you're playing some op, potentially you can res a ping on a remote server, the runner gets a tag, you can go Zato it at them, you trash a 2-coster, they're tagged, they end the run, and now you've put onto the table 1001 that you've sourced for free because you just trashed a 2-cost card. Now that they have a tag, they want to clear the tag, they have to run the remote server that has the thing in it that you've Zatoed them away from, but there's also B1000. You've built a convoluted border control, but it was pretty cool. And I think ultimately that's where I ended up on this card. I'm so glad that this card exists because it's the sort of card that so many players are going to want to go out of their way to make this thing work because the theme is really fun and because getting a hard end the run on a neutral card from another server is such a cool thing to chase. I think ultimately, if you're really good at giving someone tags, there are probably a bit more direct ways you can give tag punishment, but I'm also very fascinated to see other cards that give tags throughout this set because as we said before, with the rotation of hard-hitting news, and maybe more importantly, the rotation of some of the biggest single-card tag punishment that can just end the game, maybe we can see a bit more tags on more cards outside of more factions, and that can be a nice way to give B1001 a trail to trace. And maybe there's a chance that there's going to be a deck out there somewhere that can protect the B1001 at all costs and is going to feel very brutal and unfair. Kind of similar to when the Sandberg gets out of control. People just don't want to play that game. But I think you're going to have to work pretty hard for that. And I think there's a chance that other tag punishment might line up just as well. But it is definitely a very interesting card that a lot of people are going to want to pursue because it looks fun. And when it fires, you're going to feel really good about the combo that you set up. And real quick, in terms of the flavor behind this card, specifically the flavor text, who the patron is probably a very fascinating story. There's a couple hints hidden within this card that can push you into the right direction, but there's a very interesting story that I think is going to be unraveling at some point soon. And that is it for the 4 spoiler cards we have today. Again, shout outs to the NSG folks for sending these our way. But the set is out in less than 7 days, mind you, just the 31st of July, and they're going to be tournament legal almost immediately, which is a pretty big deal considering we have things like Continentals and Nationals coming up within the next couple weeks. Mind you, this week is the middle of still Spoilers Week, Community Spoilers Week specifically, so there are a lot of folks across the Netrunner community, whether it's podcasts or video stuff or online articles that all have their cards that they're going to be releasing. So stay tuned to whatever communities you're plugged into and spread the love. There's a lot of cool stuff out there. I promise you, I'm as excited as you are. Speaking of excited, I'd love to hear what you think about these new cards. I've been absolutely stoked about a lot of the new designs we've seen so far. Hearing what sort of interactions you think I'm off about, what sort of things you think I'm under or over evaluating. It's always nice to have another view on these sort of things. Again, the new set comes out in just a week. We'll be streaming with the new cards as soon as we can. We're going to be doing some long streams, so stay tuned to the channel. Subscribe if you want to get more content, whether it's live streams or some deck dive videos. That's largely what we're going to be doing here. But otherwise, hope we see you in Brazil. Ciao. All right, those I think are some really exciting cards from the upcoming set. Shout out to the folks at NSG that I think know how to set me up with some stuff that I'm really going to enjoy, so I appreciate that a fair bit. Speaking of I appreciate that, thank you to all these names here and of course all the Daily Cast patrons who help support this channel to allow me to put the time into this sort of videos like this, live streams, videos, deck dives, that sort of stuff. Greatly appreciated. And speaking of that, when the new set comes out, I'm excited to get back into making some content, whether it's standard or startup. Both of them having a fresh new meta is really exciting. So deck dives, I think we're gonna try and do a tier list video again. Those are always really fun. If there's any sort of ideas, things you'd like to see on this channel, definitely do let me know. Love to hear that feedback. Otherwise, hopefully you've been enjoying the community spoiler season as much as I have. Let me tell you, I'm super stoked to play some new Shaper going forward, and we've only seen 2 cards. It's pretty wild how they can do that. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in Brazil. Ciao.